security content and user administration. And he oversees the digital crimes unit there as well, and he'll be speaking as well remotely. We also have Ted Hardy, who's the program lead for the IAB, the Internet Architecture Board on Privacy and Security. We have Mark SV, who's with the engineering group of customer and partner experience at Microsoft. And then to my left, we have Audrey Plonk, who's the director, Global Cybersecurity and Internet Governance Policy at Intel Corporation. We have Bill Woodcock, who's the executive director of Packet Clearinghouse. And another panelist who we're expecting shortly is Cedric Laurent, who's a global data privacy attorney and the co-founder of the Mexican Civic Association Son Tus Datos, and has been working on privacy and security, particularly data breach issues in Latin America for the last several years. So I'm not sure where he should be coming in a little bit later. So that's the session. Those are the speakers for today. What we're going to do first is we're going to turn to, as I mentioned, Marike and Ben. So Marike, with those in the back, can you switch to her, please? We'll try. Can we switch to Marike, please? Great. Can you speak? And again, if you just introduce yourself and talk about just talk about yourself, and what we'll start with her and Ben is the first kind of questions that we have is, can you talk about the ESSAC advisory that just came out in a little bit detail for those that may have not read it so far to kick off the conversation? Thank you. Over to you.
Sure. Thank you, Robert. Inefficient credential management practices. So the reason for doing this work, was so that we could raise the awareness of the overall life cycle of credential management and what registrars and registries and the overall DNS community need to pay attention to, and also to raise the awareness of what kind of credentials there exist. We'll be really do have to look at overall practices overall over the lifetime of the credential management. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Over to you, Ben. Go ahead, we can see you. We're having audio problems with you, Ben, unfortunately. So I will maybe skip to the other panelists here, and then come back to you. Again, so what I will, yeah, we'll come back to him. And so I have the question I have for everyone here is the questions is both Marike and Ben are going to be talking about the issues of credential management and authentication issues in the DNS system, but the issue of authentication management and credential is larger than just the DNS. We have a variety of devices, the Internet of Things, and many other systems that are requiring that, and a lot of companies that are providing services, be they Microsoft, Google, or others. There are a lot of authentication challenges, and those have evolved. And so I'll have a couple of questions back and forth before we get back to Ben and Mary. Is first of all, from your perspective, do you think that authentication and credential management is an important issue, and if so, why? And so maybe we'll start with you. I'm sorry, before I start, so I have a note here for everyone is before you speak, can you just please say your name, because the session is being transcribed. Thank you.
Ted Hardy speaking. Yes, I believe it's an important issue, and I believe one of the issues that I would personally like to highlight here is that credentials always occur in contexts with some form of identity, so that you understand what the credential being presented for relates to, and well, not always, but commonly are associated with some form of identity, and so that there's a need both for credential management and management for the association between a credential and the identity or identities for which it's related. And I think that pairing of the issue is an important part of how we want to look at the data minimization side of this question, because it's very convenient to ask people to create new identities and associate new credentials for a very large number of services for the service provider, because they see each one of these as independent. But the costs of doing that over time have given rise to systems where there are single large or a group of very large IDPs, identity service providers, that verify. And that carries with it correlation risks and other security problems that give me concern, and I believe make this a particularly important issue.
Great, thank you. Please, Mark.
Mark from Microsoft. Well, Ted's actually stolen a little bit of my thunder on this. One of the things that we see at Microsoft is that there is a proliferation of identities, and that it's very hard for end users to keep track of which identity they should be using in each context, and therefore it's hard for the administrators to deliver a consistent and reliable user experience. And what am I trying to say? Well, that's really it. And so users become very frustrated with this situation, and with the rise of bring your own device, where now the authentication systems can differ from device to device. Having multiple identities is pretty problematic.
Thank you. Let me see if we can get Ben back online. Ben, are you there? We'll try you again. We may have to go to plan B, but let's, can you speak, Ben? All right, we can see you, which means I'm assuming you can hear us. So if there's any questions, what I'll probably do then is I'll ask you to speak again, see if we can hear you. If not, we'll continue going around the table, and then I'll play the video that we have with you, Mary Kay, speaking. So we have that at least as part of the conversation. All right, so yep. Can you try again? Okay. Yep, we're good. Great. Well, we'll come back to you, Merke, with some more details on the ESAC paper. But before then, I just want to go around. Audrey, if you could just make some comments on the question that I posed. We'll go around. I see Cedric is here as well, so if you speak to that, and then we'll go back for both of you who are remote to talk about the paper. I'll have a couple of questions for you, and then I'll try to have an interactive conversation with all of you and the increasing number of folks that we have in the audience. Please, over to you.
Thank you, Audrey Plunk from Intel, for the record. Just building on what Ted and Mark said, I think that the challenge of the end user to manage not only multiple identities, but a system of passwords and that really doesn't work from a security perspective today, and really forces the user to basically adopt weak security practices as a result of the technology sort of kind of lagging the need in some ways. And so I think that just to talk about a little bit the solution space, I think the direction that at least that we are, and I know in collaboration with Google and Microsoft, working on, and much of this technology is just starting to be available in the market, is sensor-based systems that use 3D cameras and accelerated computing capabilities to to do facial recognition, for multi-factor management, for individual identification. There's also new technologies that use more than just your face, but also your device, the various devices that we have to authenticate you to an application or a system going forward. And so these are technology trends that take, the goal of which I think is to take the complexity of just having users remember a lot of passwords that they actually don't remember, and then become very frustrated, as Mark said, with the system, into more technically based, all the way down into hardware features that can help authenticate the user on, if we're just talking about the credential side of things. I think at some point, on the data breach side, we might want to talk about the data security aspects, but in terms of authenticating people. So obviously that's important because the proliferation of devices, the Internet of Things, as Robert mentioned, and other technology advances, people are using more and more. They're creating more identities, but they're using more and more technologies that don't necessarily come from the same manufacturer or from the same provider, and so the ability to use those identities across different platforms is a real challenge for the user. So I think that at least that's, from an Intel perspective, what we try to put as much into hardware to allow for cross-platform harmonization, especially on authentication and on identity-related aspects. So I think that's why it's important. People will, it's an credential management, multi-factor authentication, identity is an aspect of security. Security is obviously very important to the overall ecosystem, especially to this registry issue or registrar issue that the ESAC is talking about. And so, we can talk also about policy solutions perhaps, but from technology advances, I think that's sort of some examples of where things are moving.
So Bill, maybe a directed question is in regards to Packet Clearinghouse. Why is authentication and credentials important in the work that you do?
So as most of you probably know, we operate the largest DNS network in the world, and so that serves as sort of the opposite end of the spectrum from the registrars, right? The registrars register domain names for end users with registries, then the registries use us or someone else as a DNS backend. So we're pretty far removed from the actual end user credential, so forth, right? We never see any of that. What we do have is a huge user database of security professionals, of the security contacts for most of the operational autonomous systems on the internet. So INOC-DBA, the Internet Network Operations Center dial by ASN hotline system, has 2 or 3 people in it from the security staff of every major network, about 3,000 networks out there. And so it's a closed network, but it has the sort of after-hours contact information for a whole lot of people and a way of ringing directly through to their bedside in the middle of the night. So that's probably the single area where we have to do the most careful work. And it feels like there's 3 very closely related but separate problems here. One is how you authenticate a user, right? How you determine that the person, as a service provider, how you determine that the person who you're talking to is the one that you think you're talking to. That sort of user authentication is subject to the kinds of technology that Audrey's talking about, and a lot of good practices to help keep users from shooting themselves in the foot, and is probably best handled using a key vault sort of thing on a user's device, where the user has a password that allows them to unlock different credentials for every service provider they're dealing with. Second question is, when the user is giving me as a service provider information, are they giving me more than I need? Are they giving me more than I should have? Are they giving me information that I can do something harmful to them with? Or if I lose that information, they'll be harmed in some other way. So there's no reason for me to have more than I need, and that just represents a risk to me, a risk to the user, liability all the way around. And the third is, how do I protect the data against incursion? So that's the kind of thing that we're seeing with the registrars, where hackers are breaking in and stealing an entire user database with login credentials and also financial information and personally identifiable data for a huge set of users. So it feels like each of these 3 problems, although closely related and using overlapping technology and practices to solve them, they're each sort of a different class of problem.
So we'll get that into more detail. We have a question queued up for Ben, but Cedric, from your perspective, I guess you come from a different point of view, so I'm just curious from, can you just, because you came a little bit late, just do a kind of a quick introduction, but also from your perspective and the work that you've done in Mexico and in Latin America, what worries you most about, credential management and when things go wrong?
Yes, sure. My name is Cedric Laurent. I'm an attorney in Mexico, and what I've seen in my practice is that Mexico right now is at the stage where the U.S. was in 2003. They've got a law they passed in 2010 that entered into force in 2012, and now 3 years later. But they're not exactly at the US age. They're a little bit more backwards, because most companies right now haven't, although they have the obligation to notify data breaches, pursuant to that law, none of them has done so. The few that have done so pursuant to stock exchange regulations. So it's very difficult to get statistics, to get numbers, and precise information on the causes of the data breach. It's very difficult to say whether it's a problem at the management of the credentials, whether it's the company's fault, the data controller's fault, whether it's the user, the customer's fault, in how he or she or the company managed the credentials. If I've got time a little bit later on, I could talk about a few specific cases where the problem might have been the management of credential, but it may not. It's very difficult. We don't have much information. There are 2 cases also about which I could talk, because I personally detected the problem and I notified the entities involved. So the situation is pretty blurry right now. in Mexico at least. There are two other countries in Latin America that also have data protection laws that mandate companies to notify data breaches. But in the world, apart from the US, the European Union, in the telecom and ISP sector, there are not many countries that do have those data breach notification laws that allow a certain to a certain extent to have more precise information about the origin of data breaches.
Great. We have a question for Ben, if we can get him up on. And the question for you, Ben, and maybe the rest of you, and we'll have a question directed to the audience as well in a second, is, Ben, can you tell me something from your perspective in terms of the recent attacks against registrars and registries that you mentioned in the ESAC report that took place between 2012 and 2013? Can you just maybe give some general details, if you can't speak about specifics, and if these attacks have led to data breaches of any kind, and how were they dealt with, kind of going on to the point, but from your perspective, kind of at GoDaddy, but also being an active member of the registrar community. Could you answer that, Ben, please? America, are you there? There you go. We see you. Can you speak? Over to you. Yep. Go ahead, please.
using any cloud backups, right? So are these sensitive credentials now somewhere in the cloud where if that gets compromised, right, you again have page sharing. How are you renewing the credentials? Do you have the practices in place that you're actually authenticating that individual properly to assure and ascertain that it's actually that individual who wants new credentials and not somebody impersonating them? You know, how do you go about revoking them? And also, do you actually destroy old credentials? So we do have to pay attention, you know, to the whole life cycle of credential management, which really this document was trying to bring forth. And of course, you know, it has benefits to not only the DNS industry, but basically every industry that's out there. Thank you.
Great, thank you. What I want to do is I'll maybe ask a question to you, Ted, and then maybe turn to the audience a question. But what's the IAB doing this? Is there any innovation in this space to try to improve the situation, given the severity of the attacks? And then I'll ask you the question as well in terms of what Microsoft may be doing, and maybe Intel as well, seeing that this is an issue that's getting worse. And you know, what are you doing perhaps in terms of innovative technologies or approaches so I'm just curious to hear what's coming down the pipe. Please.
Ted Hardy speaking. First and foremost, I wish I could tell you that there was some magic pixie dust that was going to come along and fix this problem. But I fear that I must disappoint both myself and the audience on the pixie dust question. When what you're doing is trying to manage a security relationship, the critical thing you have to start with is what's the threat model that you're trying to meet. And so the first step I think that the IAB is trying to do is to try and get people to go back and look at what the threat models that they were trying to meet with some of these systems actually were. And I think Marika was just mentioning the fact that she actually reuses credentials on sites she doesn't care about. And the upshot of that is that as a security professional, her threat model analysis tells her that there's functionally no threat. And though somebody wanted a unique login, it wasn't actually for a security purpose. It was for a logging purpose or for associating some form of understanding of which articles had already been read in a CSS. So one of the main thrusts of the ITF's work in security at this moment is data minimization. We're trying to make sure that the amount of data shared is at the minimum required to make a transaction happen. And so the advice we're giving at this point is, hey, if you're collecting data, you don't actually use, it's a liability, as Bill pointed out, either directly or if there should be a breach as a potential source of spear phishing to somebody else. And we've seen these sort of escalation attacks where somebody can get, you know, the last 4 digits of your social security number from one provider and they get your email address from somebody else, and then they use that to get your Amazon account to get a larger amount of thing, and they build their way up from there. So data minimization as sort of a key thrust of our efforts is something that I think will continue. The other point that I'll make is we're trying very hard to get people to look at the internet as encrypted by default. And there are trust issues with the internet based on surveillance that make that true. But it turns out that it's also relevant here, because in a lot of situations where people deploy interception proxies, what they're actually also doing is creating another security target that can be compromised and which has a huge amount of contentious data in it. Sorry, not contentious data, but confidential data. And we believe that as we move forward with that security effort to try and make well-crafted end-to-end encrypted flows on the internet, we're actually also reducing this risk. But functionally, there never will be any pixie dust for this. There's some wonderful things that are going on with two-factor where it's not what you know and what you have, but what are you close to? If you have both my laptop and my phone, maybe that's enough to get the Washington Post subscription that I really don't care about, right? But the core thing around the data security practices for credential management really is going to continue to require the kind of work that has already gone into this best practices document and other things.
Well, Microsoft has been investing a lot in multi-factor authentication and also in encryption by default, encryption at rest, encryption between the customer and the data center, encryption when transmitting between data centers. And we had started that before the Snowden disclosures, but that gave us a new impetus. I'd actually be curious to know how much energy is expended, just doing all this encryption, but that's a separate topic. We're big believers in multi-factor authentication, but that, of course, that assumes that it actually works. So if it doesn't, when it's down, that's another point of failure, frustrating customers. And it's great if my phone can authenticate my laptop, but if I'm just working from my phone and I don't have my laptop, that's a little bit more problematic. Lastly, I'm very concerned about best practices documents. The best practice document for protecting Microsoft Active Directory, which is our premium credential system, is 500 pages. And I have read it. And it spans different levels of detail from novices and CEOs down to security professionals, but it's a very detailed and daunting document. And when people don't have a lot of time or the correct level of expertise, the proliferation of best practices documents, I think, is a little bit concerning. We're seeing this with the SHA-1 hash deprecation, where many of our customers were not even aware of the issue until we issued a blog post that said we might move up our deadline. And then suddenly people said, move up what deadline? What does this mean for me? And again, we live in a complicated system of a heterogeneous system where you might have suppliers that take dependencies on each other that you don't understand. So for instance, even within Microsoft, if you are using one version, an older version of System Center Configuration Manager, and then Windows changes its SHA-1 hash policy, you may find that the older version of your management software doesn't support the new certificates that are being enforced by Windows. And so that's a Microsoft-only solution if you're homogeneous. If you have a heterogeneous system, you may find that in actual practice, you can't enforce some of these best practices because not all suppliers work together. So no, there's no pixie dust, and possibly there's more issues that we haven't thought about because they're not necessarily technical. I mean, they may have technical underpinnings, but they come down to just the complexity of sourcing your technology providers.
So I think on the topic of data breaches and securing data, one of the most important practices, at least as everybody's already mentioned, is encryption and doing good encryption. And I think one of the biggest challenges to adoption of strong encryption has been limited compute cycles, so slowing down performance of machines because the processing power that it takes to do encryption is fairly intense. And so I think one of the contributions that Intel is making to that problem is to add compute cycles in the CPU to accelerate specific encryption algorithms to allow for better encryption at the layers above. It's not pixie ducks. There's this is a defense in depth sort of, all security problems are defense in depth set of problems where you need to deploy a lot of different solutions to solve different problems, because there's not one technical solution or policy solution that will address the breadth of security problems, but just being able to address the fundamental reason that people are challenged in deploying encryption, we believe will help at least accelerate adoption on the end of encrypting data. There are other related hardware features that allow for encrypted key storage and authentication of applications within the hardware, so that you can at least limit the sort of attack around specific applications and segment them off. So things like trusted platform modules in the hardware, or trusted execution technologies will help solve different aspects of data security problems, and allow for a little bit more trust and confidence in how to access that data. So those are sort of technology solutions around protecting the data, which are different than authenticating the user or managing a user's credentials. The policy aspects of data breach, I think notification are interesting, especially the recommendation in the STAC report around ICANN making the data breach information from registrars public in a way that I think my understanding is at least doesn't happen now. Is I think there's a lot of value in that, depending on what kind of guidance. It's not always useful to just tell people there's a problem if there isn't solutions provided to them. So I think that's something to think through. If the SSAC hasn't already done that, is in addition to saying, oh, there are all these bad things, then also following it up with how people can actually do something about it is really important. So, but I do, transparency in the security space is, there's no security in obscurity. So I think that's a good recommendation to pursue in a little bit more depth.
So I'm going to maybe jump a queue a little bit, but going to your question, we had a question from a remote participant that you kind of raised as well. And so I'll maybe go to Cedric, because you mentioned earlier. So I'll do that, and then I'll go to the audience, and then I'll come back to the panel. Some of you talked about the reporting of security breaches, and in the report that SSAC came out with was security breaches from registries and registrars. So making the data breaches more public, is that actually going to change anything? Is that going to lead to a change of business practice? And so we'd be interested to hear from you, Cedric, because you're talking about that you have seen some data breaches take place in Mexico and Latin America. So as a result of those breaches, has anything changed?
So far, it's a little bit too early to say, because so far there have only been, I think, about 8, 9, or 10 cases revealed publicly. Some of them have gone to the Data Protection Authority for them to inquire. The ones that have been investigated by the Procuraduría General de la República, which is the Ministry of Justice in Mexico, haven't been very public. The public has not been informed exactly of what has happened, but at least from the Data Protection Authority side, for a breach that happened in December last year, the Data Protection Authority hasn't released any information yet, apart from saying in a Facebook post of 3-4 lines in March of this year that it was investigating. There was another big breach involving a Mexican bank, Banorte. The Data Protection Authority did fine the company for 34 million pesos, which is about $2 million. There is a case in which the Data Protection Authority itself was involved, which I detected personally. I informed a commissioner, one of the 7 commissioners of the INAI, and the situation was fixed pretty quickly. And they did the good thing, which is notify the 155 person involved. It involved putting on a web server the scans of contest applicants who had to send their ID information. Everything had been scanned, included fingerprint, signature, domicile, etc. Everything had been available for probably 7 months. So there must have been, what happened is that they put information on a web server, they didn't relate to it on the official website, but the information was indexed by Bing, Yahoo, and Google. So there was another problem involving the department store Liverpool, which is kind of a store like a Macy's or Nordstrom. And in that case, it was probably an insider job who released lots of information that, although it didn't involve directly credentials, will help people to break into the credentials of several employees of the company. It involved credit card information, internal manuals revealing how the encryption system works, how the point of sale terminals work, what kind of encryption is used, etc. So all information could be used later, of course, to break into the company. Information to the company's users or employees, credentials, etc. There was another case involving Mexico's major public university, the UNAM, which I detected about 1.5 years ago, and that I informed the university about. It might have involved credential management issue. There was another problem involving Mexico's, probably Latin America's biggest telecommunications company, Telmex, in which they hadn't updated for about 1.5 years their web servers, the webmail servers. The company, the affiliate of Telmex, called Prodigy, and it involved at least 2,500 email accounts being indexed by Google, and by putting the name of the person or his email, it was possible to access the inbox of that person's Prodigy email account directly, and even to send emails on his or her behalf.
So it seems like a lot of cases.
A lot of cases, but not much has been done. The Data Protection Authority hasn't done much so far.
So, just seeing the time as well too, I saw a couple of hands in the audience, and so before we get talking, I'm just wondering, first of all, if there's, I have a question for a couple of people in the audience that I know are here, but is there any questions from the audience to the panel or to the topics that has been discussed? You, sir, first, and then you in the second row there. If you could just line up behind him, and we'll get 3 questions, please. Sir, please, your name, affiliation, and your question.
I'm Barry Liba. I'm IETF Applications Area Director. And I've heard a lot of talking about password vaults and how to manage all these credentials and that sort of thing. But even two-factor authentication, when your thumbprint unlocks your phone, it's one thing. When your thumbprint is sent over the wire, it's just another password that happens to be hard to type in. I haven't heard anybody talking about changing authentication mechanisms to get away from shared secrets and the sorts of things where reusable credentials are sent over the wire. Systems where even if what goes over the wire is tapped or a compromise happens on the server, what they get is not reusable and can't mimic you.
Anyone want to try? Maybe both of you can try.
Ted Hardy speaking. I think there are 2 problems here that sort of relate to how users interact with the service that go to why that particular question isn't kind of a common one. And one is that for a lot of these services, even if you move to two-factor authentication, what they need at account activation time, when what's happening is you're saying this is me and they're authenticating you for an authorization purpose or an accounting purpose, is a great deal of speed. They want this to be a seamless experience. And so you could make it a more complex process where the generation of the credential occurred at the time you wanted to use a service, and it essentially was a very short-lived credential that lasted through the period of time that it was active, and then you had to restart. From a kind of a security professional perspective, there are some advantages to that, but from a usability perspective, what it ends up looking like to the end user, if you're using this sort of recreation of credentials, is they have to start over every time. And the service provider wants their relationship to the end user to be sticky. They want it to be kept. And so they actually want to be sure that the person that's using a credential is the same over time, so that they can understand who their customer is and what it looks like. There is some work going on to try and create sort of the equivalent of forward security for transactions. But as far as I know, it's still mostly research. I'd be happy to hear of stuff that's further along.
So I don't have any big picture answers that are any different than what Ted has just said. I think I would concur exactly. Just to put some kind of practical examples behind that, because what the internet industry funds us to do in large part is to sort of examine and try different practices and help develop best practices for the internet service provider industry. And this question of authentication is a big one. One of the things that we've worked on and feel like we have a best practice around is the password rigor checking, right? So you're all familiar with the thing where you generate a password or make something up and it says, sorry, you didn't have both an uppercase and a lowercase and your dog's name, right? And so sometimes this rigor checking can be very artificial and itself problematic because the things it's requiring constrain the size of the password space, right? If you know what it's requiring, which is generally easy to do because you just go and you try creating an account and see what it tells you, right? So what we do instead of that is we have a piece of Java that runs in the customer's browser, in the user's browser, that helps them figure out what their password is going to be before it gets sent over the wire. And it is just checking how many bits of entropy in the string they enter, right? And we only allow password validity equal to the time to crack the password that they've put in. So for the vast majority of passwords that people first try, because we do send back statistics sometimes to help us understand how this is working, the vast majority of passwords that people try, the time to crack is like in the single digit milliseconds, right? So like 5 milliseconds to crack most passwords that most people put in most of the time. But if people are using a password vault of some kind and an automatic password generator, it's easy to create passwords that will take billions or trillions of years to crack, right? Sorry, no. Billions or trillions of available cycles and so forth. The issue is that the further out in time you get, what Moore's law says is that the computing cycles available are going to become cheaper. So there's a decaying curve here, right? In that there's a certain point you get to, and I'm sorry, I don't remember what it is. It's in the, sorry, I'm not going to talk off the top of my head. There's a point beyond which making the password longer doesn't buy you as much additional time because the processors will get faster and faster and so forth. And at that point, different solutions are just going to be necessary. Like passwords in any reasonable length, right? Passwords of under, say, hundreds or thousands of characters are not going to be useful anymore. So this combination of giving people direct feedback about the strength of the password that they've put in, not just it's a little bar and it's green or red, but actually telling them, here's how long it will take to crack this, and then not allowing them to use the same password beyond that time gives a set of incentives that cause people to move to better password regimes. That's, our
So we just have a lot of questions lining up. So we had a second question from the floor, and then after you, we have a remote question, and then I actually have a question for a couple people in the audience. So please, sir, your name and your question.
Hello, my name is Florian and I'm from the youth IGF. And I totally understand the point that encryption is important, but with encryption you say it's safe enough, but it's never 100% safe. So when I heard the example that with basically simple phishing, as a hacker you are able to get the access to A records, that's rather concerning, because I would say that's a user, a power user, who should be able to identify phishing and to prevent himself from sending passwords via the wire to random people. So do you think it's maybe more important to really focus on those power users who have the ability to access a vast majority of important data, like A records, and make their access more secure, so get rid of normal passwords, use something else as, I don't know, as somebody else, I think you have already asked about the more advanced identification systems, like, I don't know, biological sensors, stuff like that. So to really focus on those power users instead of the common user.
Great. Let me turn to Ben and Merke online if you want to try to address this question and maybe the ones raised earlier. Ben, maybe to you first. Thank you. Merke, do you want to comment?
Of all the different credentials between the different interactions between the registrar, and registree, so that people would understand and actually be able to visualize all the different identities that are being utilized and think of what's really important in their environment. And so this is true for any business also, right? Look at, where is access really critical, and then put in the protections and the controls so that it's really hard for somebody to gain unauthorized access and potentially impersonate either the application, the device, or the machine. And we talk a lot, I think, as most people always, when they think about credentials, they think about a password. But it's not just a password. I mean, applications maybe identify, to each other, if they need access for machines, right? For example, there was this protocol, in my opinion, underutilized, but IP set. And basically you use an IP address, right, of a machine to actually authenticate to its peer. And then people later decided that, oh, wait a minute, I actually want to know who the user is behind the machine. So then you had a machine credential, and you also had a user and password credential. And so really we need to understand what is being authenticated and how, and then absolutely look at how to protect that as best as possible. And remember, it's not only with credential management. I mean, security is holistic. And so you also have to look at monitoring effectively so that you can determine whether or not there's a potential potential impersonation going on, or whether or not somebody is gaining unauthorized access. I'd also like to make the point that what is really necessary in the industry is not just telling people what to do, but how to do it. Because so many people talk about two-factor authentication, multi-factor authentication is the best way to go. Yet when somebody tries to do it in their environment, right, they might Google for two-factor authentication, best practices, and they get 1,000 documents. And so I had the good fortune of being invited to attend the last DLD Tech Workshop that was a couple of months ago in Chile, in Santiago. And what I was extremely happy to see was that one of the registries, or rather CCTLDs, they gave a presentation of how they implemented two-factor authentication. They gave their thought process in terms of what worked for them. If the two-factor mechanism was not available for whatever reason, how they handled that problem, and then also some of the gotchas that they ran into, some of the mistakes that they made early on, and then how they fixed it. And so I think that as a community, we really need to be much better to also help educate each other, not just what to do, but also how to do it. That's all I want to say at this point.
Great, thank you. I have a question for someone in the audience, someone who just came. So Christian Dawson, if you're up, I just maybe wanted to ask you, if I'm not mistaken, you're with an association that represents a lot of small and hosting providers and ISPs, and so from your perspective, some of the smaller players perhaps, do you see this as an issue that's affecting your community? And if so, to Marika's point, what is being done in terms of for the users or maybe for the technical staff at these smaller kind of firms to recognize a problem and try to be ahead of it?
It's a fantastic question. I appreciate it. Can you hear me? So, not enough. And though I completely respect and appreciate all the tremendous efforts that are going into the organizations that are taking leads on making great strides in making sure that we are secure in very technical ways, at the ground level, we do have this issue where, okay, when people build their businesses online using the cloud, it's still pretty complicated. And so they turn to the people down the street. They turn to people that they know in order to help them try and navigate the cloud. And these consultants, these managed hosting providers, some of them are not tremendously sophisticated. Some of them do not have a tremendous amount of knowledge about how to deal with things. And so I see regularly situations where people are saying, well, go ahead and send me your root password over your email. And they're not even using PGP because it's hard. Because people, just explaining to a business person how you're going to set up an encryption key on your email, we're not there yet. And so a lot of the times, we can talk about very sophisticated ways of dealing with these issues, but we're still got some very fundamental problems at the ground level that we need to deal with, just with simple things like, okay, you can't even just say, don't send your root password over email. You need to say, here are some fundamental alternatives to doing that. They're going to work for a small business, that are going to work for a one-man operation, that are going to give you the tools necessary in order to allow these non-technical people to build their businesses, but do it in a way that still makes it easy enough for them to comply and keep things safe. We still need that outreach. It's not quite there yet. But that's where I'd like to see more efforts come in privacy and security.
Do you have a question for us at all?
A question for you. Do you know of good efforts that are that are going on to aid these very small businesses, these micro businesses, in learning the fundamentals of not just what to do, but how security can be operationalized at a micro level?
Great. Marika, do you want to try a stab at that? And then I'll open it if there's anyone else that wants to comment on that.
Operational person wrote a quick 1 or 2 pager in terms of here's what I've done and here's what I ran into. And I really think that as an industry, we need to do more of that. Just really help the person, people with fundamental operational aspects, especially for people that aren't very tech savvy, and just explain to them, what not to do. Because if they did certain practices like sending credentials out in the clear, and as an example, there was a breach in one of the registrars or a reseller just within the last 12 months, and it was highly publicized that they were sending renewed credentials over clear text email, right? And a lot of security colleagues of mine made a lot of fun of them, whereas I said, that's not the right thing to do. What we need to do is educate these people. I mean, they just didn't have, unfortunately, the right mindset to know that that was a bad thing. So we need to do much more to really help these people out. And yeah, so that's my perspective.
Great. Thank you. Another comment here.
So while I certainly value education, I believe in the common case here, because what we're trying to do is to make this easy enough that it's not a significant barrier to people setting up these businesses. It's not a significant barrier to them managing their online presence or identity. That what we need to do is to make a lot of the systems confidential by default, so that if somebody is sending information across an HTTP link, for example, that's confidential by default. It's HTTPS rather than HTTP, because that reduces both the risk to the end user and the kind of cognitive burden they have to bear to make this actually more secure. And I think when I look at the work that Intel and others are doing in kind of multi-factor authentication with the, hey, here's a little button you wear on your shirt, and when you want to open your phone, you touch the phone to the button and it opens up. So it's secure without you having to type in a passphrase, right? That's a Motorola technology. But that sort of thing is actually meant to accomplish a security goal in a way that's simple enough to demonstrate in 10 seconds. And that when we think about educating people, we have to match that to lowering the barrier enough that the education really does, fit in an elevator ride. And the better we can make the systems in terms of default confidentiality and security, so that they don't have to do anything to get that property, the better we can make the credentialing mechanism so that they really could be explained in an elevator ride, the more likely we are to see all of this not be a barrier to online participation or business, et cetera. I also think that that's not pixie dust. And I know that when I was talking earlier, I said there is no pixie dust. There is work going on that leads us in that direction, but it takes deployment, and it takes a fairly serious amount of systems engineering on the provider side to make that work. where I think the folks like the ITF, Barry represents them, can help is in making sure that you don't have to learn a new one for every provider, right? And so in ICANN space, the work of the SAC can be to help ensure that there's enough interoperability among registries which might use such a system that you could actually move providers without having to get a whole new vision of this. And I think the interoperability is another way we can lower the barrier to actually using these practices in real life.
Thank you. I just want to check, did we have any questions on remote questions? So if we do, could we go to the remote question, please?
Thank you, Chair. We have a remote participation from Robert Gonzalez from Huntington Beach, California, and he asks, for Microsoft, is there anything in the works similar to the LastPass password management but utilize your two-step mobile app Microsoft account?
Could you please repeat the question about the last something password?
Yeah. Is there anything in the works similar to the LastPass password management but utilize your two steps mobile app Microsoft account?
I'm afraid I don't know the answer to that. I'm sorry.
Okay. Thank you.
It's certainly very possible. A lot of the technologies that have been discussed here today are in fact either in place at Microsoft or in the works. I don't know the details of that particular one.
We had one question from the floor. So, to you.
Hello, my name is Alan. I'm from the Youth IGF, and you've already talked about some ways that normal people have to protect themselves to be attacked by illegally people who are trying to break into their accounts. But I'd like to know more tips, practical tips that we could spread to people how to protect themselves, because generally the people don't know technical things, but some tips that we can use to protect ourselves from being attacked by a malware or something like that.
So, given we have about 10 minutes, I'll maybe add something to this question. So you're talking about kind of tip, and what I'll maybe go around the panel in terms of resources. So are there, what are organizations or resources or materials that your entity or your organization has that would be helpful not only for the end user, but also for the small and medium. So what can you suggest in regards to resources and other organizations that could help with the education piece? So maybe Cedric, we haven't heard from you in a while, so I'm just curious from your perspective in Latin America and more from I would say a user perspective. Can you comment where should people go? So where in your region do people go? You talked about the Data Protection Authority. So is that the golden standard where everyone go, or do people go to a particular, do they go to your organization to find out more, and what incentivizes them?
Well, the Data Protection Authority in Mexico has published several very good documents. One is for small and medium-sized companies to implement the law, which goes into a lot of details and which has a chapter dedicated to security measures. So the manual is specifically for those small and medium-sized businesses. It also has released a 500-page document that explains how the various certification, the various information security standards can be implemented in pursuant to the law, making the correspondence between what the law says security measures should be and what those security standards say. I'm the president of a non-profit organization, and we release materials not so much right now on security. I personally push all my staff to use encryption, PGP, for example. But most of the public is not very much aware of how to use it. I've got to say that, although to contrast a little bit this gloomy perspective I gave, that the banking industry, for example, has developed very strong standards. I do have an account with a US bank and one and two with a Mexican bank, and the Mexican bank has developed a double authentication mechanism that's much stronger than the US bank. So just to contrast a little bit. But in general, it's the general public that's not much aware of how to use security measures. But there is good work being done by the Data Protection Authority to publish documents in that regard.
I'm afraid I don't have any very good references, places to tell you to turn for information. It's simply not my area of expertise. As far as tips, the vast majority of the problems that end users encounter are things that they interact with through the web browser. So be very careful about clicking on links. When possible, type in a URL to a destination that you know you want to go to rather than just clicking on something that somebody else has presented to you, particularly an email. I try to use safe browsing mode in my browser whenever possible so that it is exposing less information about me than perhaps it would otherwise. This is an arms race, right? All the advertisers and people doing malware and so forth are constantly trying to overcome the protections that get built into browsers with more and more persistent cookies and so forth. So keep your browser up to date and don't store the passwords in the browser, right? Use a separate password management application. Use it to create your passwords, not just to store ones that you make up. As Ted and Medica have said, you don't need to put in a huge amount of effort for things you're not going to use again, or where you're not disclosing any personal information, or where there's no risk. But do be aware that these things essentially never go away, right? They only proliferate. You give a password that you make up to your supermarket in exchange for a little discount, and the supermarket will get broken into dozens of times over the next few years. Most of this will go unacknowledged, but that password, that username, so forth, will be correlated in databases that will be sold on from one hacker to another hacker to another hacker. And that password, even if that password was initially a well-created one, that particular password will always be easy to guess from then on for anyone hacking. So.
Great, thanks. And I just ask for everyone to keep their comments short, and we'll maybe go over a few minutes, but we just have about a little bit under 4 minutes left.
Thanks. So I think there are, in addition to what Bill said, there's a lot of organizations in different countries who are specifically responsible for public awareness aspects of cybersecurity. And so I think I'm happy to point you to some of those references. I think it's a model, there's a role for public awareness around all kinds of safety and security issues and privacy issues. And I think that cooperation between government and the private sector in this area has really stepped up over the years. And you see sort of governments taking responsibility for launching the public awareness campaigns, and the private sector taking responsibility for populating the system of what are the best practices along the lines of what the sort of things that Bill just described. So happy to point you to some of those resources as examples that you might want to take back to your country and see if you can get something like that going.
Mark from Microsoft. Microsoft does provide a lot of resources for small and medium businesses, training sessions and seminars, train the trainer, and certainly consulting is available either as part of an enterprise contract if you're a large company, or on contract if you're a smaller company. I think that a lot of consumer protections will be regulated, either starting in regulated businesses or in the public sector. We are always concerned about the proliferation of regulations and would like to keep them consolidated, but I think that's a good driver of user protection because the user doesn't need to think about it as much. Things will be implemented in a way that protects them. And then finally, for end users, we do see that in many places, people are aware that they should look at the URL, that they should look at the email address, and I think that universal acceptance, which is the idea that all top-level domains, internationalized domains, and internationalized emails should be supported by all systems in the DNS, in email providers, in browsers, in your bank account, things like that. That will really add another level of security and awareness to users when they're no longer interacting with the internet in a script that is different from their native language, and they can actually look at it and inspect it and say, that looks legitimate because I can read the Thai language and I see that this is in Thai script and it does look legitimate.
In the course of a workshop yesterday, I happened to talk to one of the folks from the Data Protection Authority from Argentina, and I understand that she's worked out a fair number of resources for both Argentina and in general on data privacy, so they may also have material similar to the one Cedric mentioned from Mexico. I think the one thing I want to pick up from what Bill was saying, though, is that correlation is a big issue. And earlier I said that doing a threat model analysis of what you're actually giving up to get, the Washington Post or the LA paper or whatever your equivalent is, you have to realize that if that does become compromised, it becomes part of the metadata available to somebody that could be associated with your identity. And so once again, that question of how you associate an identity with this has to be managed in the same way you manage a credential. So if you use an email address as an identity in both your bank and the LA Times, and you use let's say your dog's name for the password for the LA Times, which you don't care about very much, it still becomes part of the metadata available to an attacker to your financial things who might be able to find out your password using a password recovery question that's about your dog's name. So these things kind of become part of the kind of cloud of information a determined hacker can make about someone. So even if you don't think you're potentially the victim or a potential victim of spear phishing, where somebody's working very hard to get your individual credentials, you have to understand that the overall amount of effort that they have to put in to get something for you goes down every time you link a new credential to a single identity. So as service providers, we have to think about how to make that problem better by making it possible to create accounts which actually don't use that kind of identity at all. But in the meantime, you should be considering the linkage between those two as you decide what your threat model for a particular situation should be.
Thank you. We could go on, but unfortunately we've run out of time. I will make a quick comment is for those of you that are interested, I'd like to make sure that the conversation continue. For those of you using Twitter, hashtag WS13, which is the workshop for this room. And so if you have any comments or any questions or any resources, post them there. I'll stay around for about 20 minutes if others want to comment. If we have some time, I can give the remote experts maybe 2 minutes to speak. So with the indulgence of the staff, can we connect to Mary for 2 minutes and then to Ben for their concluding comments? And then I'll thank everyone. So Mary, over to you.
which is becoming more and more common to want to understand whether or not you're using some kind of cloud service to back that up and where your credentials are actually going, where they could potentially be breached. Another aspect I want to bring up is that I am Estonian. I have an Estonian national ID card. Utilizing that card, which embeds technology, certificate-based technology, makes it extremely simple for me to access a lot of services remotely. And so there was a lot of public, private, government partnerships that went into that. So I think that's also something to look into because, again, it's easier to actually use this national ID card and connect that to my computer where I don't have to remember a particular password or passphrase. That's my comment.
Great. Ben, any quick 1-2 minute comment? So with that, I'd like to thank all the experts on stage, some of which came at short notice. I really appreciate you engaging in this conversation, and hope we can all stay in touch. And I also thank those that came in the audience first thing in the morning on the first day. And again, I'll be around for about 20 minutes and key that this conversation and any resources and any comments that were made, I'll make sure to include them in the workshop report as well. So thank you all for coming, and thanks to all the experts and those who participated remotely at very early in the morning. So thanks to everyone.